Hi, I'm Dr. Yopp, an advanced grief recovery method specialist certified by the Grief Recovery Institute. Let's have a quick chat about grief. In today's episode of Takeaways About Grief, we will chat about some of the physical impacts of unresolved grief. And as always, I'm sharing from this life-changing resource, the Grief Recovery Handbook. So let's jump into our primary takeaway from today's chat. Takeaway number one is that it is common for our bodies to display a reaction or reactions to our grief. From a personal grieving perspective, as well as from a professional grief specialist perspective, I believe it is safe to say that when we are grieving, we begin to experience a massive loss of energy, right? At times, it's all you can do as a griever to get out of bed and go through the motions of making it through the day, let alone making it through the week or month. Just reflect for a moment on your loss. Do you remember that lack of energy? I remember very well after my son died at birth, feeling as if I was in a zombie-like state for years, even after giving birth to my beautiful daughter, Catherine, who's now 22 years old. The reason is because, and here's takeaway number two, unresolved grief consumes a tremendous amount of energy. What usually happens is that we endure a loss and our grief is buried under the surface, right? Why? Because as we've chatted about before, we have been socialized to bury our grief and just move on, right? Failing to realize, and even some mental health professionals fail to realize, that unresolved loss accumulates, and negatively so, eventually placing us in a state of discombobulation. When would you say your energy is most efficient? It's when our minds and bodies are in tune to each other, right? In harmony. A problem with unresolved grief, though, is that it tends to separate us from ourselves. For example, how many times have you been driving and suddenly remember nothing about the drive for the last couple of blocks? You were in your head having a phantom conversation with someone who has died or a former spouse, and the conversation represents an aspect of unfinished or unresolved emotional business between you and someone else, living or dead. So again, takeaway number two, holding on to unresolved grief consumes massive amounts of energy, takes our mind and body out of harmony, and keeps us feeling exhausted. So let's continue with a few other ways unresolved grief can physically impact you. Maybe shortly after a loss, you found yourself involved in an auto accident, or you remember incidents like bumping into things more often and hurting yourself. This is because, takeaway number three, unresolved grief negatively impacts our concentration and causes us to lose focus. Takeaway number four, you may have had major illness the weeks and months following a loss. Because just like we display our emotions to loss through tears and so forth, it's common for our bodies to display a reaction to grief as well. A big area impacted by unresolved grief is likely your eating habits. It's common that you may find yourself eating less and losing weight while grieving. When we think back to takeaway number two regarding the enormous amount of energy unresolved grief consumes from us, it may simply become too much of a chore to eat. You just don't have the energy or motivation to cook or even order for delivery or takeout. And in light of takeaway number three, loss of concentration, when you are experiencing an emotional loss, you lose concentration and may very well simply forget to eat altogether. Or maybe it's that because of your unresolved grief, you just don't find joy in eating as you did before your loss. Maybe eating and cooking and trying new foods and places to eat were things you enjoyed doing with the person you lost, and the idea of doing them without your loved one simply brings you no joy, causing you to eat less. Please understand that all of these responses are normal and natural reactions to your loss. You are grieving. At the end of this video, I will include the link to an article that goes into more detail about the impact of grief on your eating habits, as well as some great suggestions on how to get back to healthier eating habits after a loss. So here's our final takeaway for this episode. Number five, Holding on to unresolved grief stifles or restricts our aliveness, meaning life becomes something to endure rather than something to live and enjoy and to embrace. And it's all because of the myths and misinformation about grief that we've been taught during our lifetime. It is important to know that whatever your response is, your grief is unique to you. And know that grief is natural and grief is normal. I would love the opportunity to teach you the steps that would enable you to resolve your grief so that you can continue living life to the fullest. So for more information on the grief recovery method or to register for one-on-one online grief recovery sessions with me, text me at 813-324-4474.